Myös tämän vuoden ainoa ulkomainen kunniamies, eli englantilainen videopelikäsikirjoittaja Rhianna Pratchett, joka tuli perjantaina ensimmäistä kertaa elämässään Suomeen tänne meidän Fanfest-tapahtumaan nimenomaan. Ja sitten vaihdakin kieltä. Okay, so I was just giving a brief introduction to you in Finnish, in case people didn't know why they were here. And so I'd like you to briefly introduce yourself in your own words, as in who you are, what you do, and where you come from.
I'm Rhianna Pratchett. I'm a writer, predominantly in video games, doing comics, film, TV, non-fiction and short stories. And I live in London. I've worked in the video game industry for about 15 years, about 5 of that in game journalism and 10 of that in game development.
Well, that was neat and concise. Okay, so we'll start by breaking the ice with a few moving-related questions, because everyone seems to be asking you about movements. And let's see. Well, you told us that, or rather told me that you're a big, huge Moomin fan. So, who's your favourite Moomin character, and what's your favourite Moomin book?
I'm very fond of Little My, and I also have a soft spot with Rogue as well. I mean, they're all great characters, and I started off with the books actually. I'm quite a Moomin purist in that way, and so I never really got into the cartoons, although in the UK we had quite a weird, it wasn't exactly a cartoon, they were like Moomins made out of felt, and they were kind of animated, and it was a little bit creepy, and I think a lot of English kids who are about my age now kind of found Moomins quite scary because of the fuzzy felt animation that we got. But I started with the books at quite a young age, and my parents were really into the Moomins as well, and Dad built me Moomin Valley out of paper mache. It's about that big. It was in my room. And he built me Moomin House as well, and he made all the Moomins out of clay and painted them. And it was one of those things that you wish you kept hold on as a kid, because I think I was quite young when he did it, and it sort of got lost over time. And I remember at my parents' house one time, I had an inkling of where there might be one Moomin in a box somewhere, and Dad and I were like rummaging through boxes from about 30 years ago trying to find the one Moomin that might still exist that he made me. And so I grew up in the books. I think my favourites are probably Comet in Moominland, especially for the wonderful scene of them walking across the dried sea, dried up sea on stilts, and also the scene where they throw the woolly trousers to the crocodile, which sounds very, very random, but if you know the book, you'll understand why. I'm also a big fan of Exploits of Moominland as well. That's got wonderful scenes in as well. And I think that's a big one of Dad's as well. And they're just so cosy and weird and warm and sort of surreal all at the same time. And it's just one of those things that Moomins genuinely make me happy. And it's only now that we started getting Moomin toys and Moomin shops over in the UK now. So I've got a kind of growing collection, and I have a big Moomin at home that has a Panama hat and sits and watches my fiance play GTA 5, and I've got like lots of little collections of Moomin. So yeah, it's just a very happy memory from my childhood.
Yes, and to those who might not already know, the Dad that she's referring to is Terry Pratchett, obviously, and we'll get the watch-related question out of the way first, because Rhianna is apparently currently working on a TV series based on the Discworld books, The Watch. So basically, you can share what little you can talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, all I can say is kind of what's out there at the moment, but you might not be aware of what is out there. So about a year ago, we formed a production company called Narrativia. And those that are familiar with my dad's book will know that Narrativia is the goddess of story. And there's four of us behind Narrativia, myself, my dad, Rob Wilkins, my dad's PA, and Rod Brown, who worked a lot on the Sky adaptations of Dad's books. And it was sort of formed with the idea of kind of centralising things like adaptations and spin-offs and what have you, all kind of Pratchett stuck in the same place. And a couple of the projects we've been working on, one with Predominance TV production, the other one is The Watch, very much The Watch. And so what's known about it at the moment is that it's a spin-off. So it's taking old characters from The Watch, Brian, Angus, Sally, etc., all the ones you know and love, and introducing some new characters along the way. And it's spin-off stories, so we're not doing guards or men at arms. We're taking those characters and doing spin-off stories in that world with them. So at the moment it's still in development, and TV development takes a very long time. As we're doing it in partnership with BBC Worldwide at the moment, we're working with a really talented writer called Guy Burt, who writes a lot of the Borgias, and also something called Bletchley Circle. He's a huge Discworld fan as well, so that's the stage it's in at the moment. It is still in development, it's going well, it's all good. Hopefully we'll have more announceable news soon.
Yes, and hopefully all the Discworld fans will be able to enjoy the series once it comes out, and then you'll know who's working behind it. And so let's move on to video games, considering that is what you do. So I'm guessing that you get asked this question a lot, but we'll still ask it anyway. So how did you originally get into the video game business?
Well, I started off playing games when I was about 6, and again that was thanks to Dad, because I'm an only child, so I didn't have brothers and sisters to kind of give me any indication of what my gender should or shouldn't like, and so I just went with what seemed interesting. And Dad was always, messing around with computers or electronics or robotics, and so I was kind of interested in that. And he brought home a game called Mazox on the Sinclair ZX81. And I was quite, he says I was quite scared about it a bit at first, because it was one of the first 2D dungeon crawlers. It was a sort of it was a pixelated dungeon, a sort of little pixelated man running around with little pixelated creatures, and I was quite scared. I'd never seen anything like it before, and then I realised the little pixelated man with a little pixelated sword and could kill the creatures, and then that was it for me. I was hooked, and I would get my dad's hand-me-down machines, or we would play games together actually. Gaming for me was always quite a social experience, so Dad would kind of drive the games, and I would either sit behind him, or he had a very big chair, and I'd sort of tuck myself behind him, and I would sort of navigate him through the game. So I'd get out the graph paper and I literally draw the maps for him, for things like Head Over Heels and Night Law, Alien 8, Alien Highway, and it was a great sort of father-daughter bonding experience, I think. And then after that, I lived in such a tiny, tiny town in England. I mean, it was kind of one lane, 40 houses, 50 houses in the whole village. It was a tiny village. There weren't very many kids there, so when a little girl moved next door to me when I was she was 8 and I was 11, and we started playing adventure games together. We played things like Monkey Island, Conquest of Camelot, Police Quest, Space Quest. I don't think we were terribly good at it. I don't remember us finishing many, but I do remember us trying to guess the Are You 18 questions that used to be at the start of Leisure Suit Larry. And they were all about the American political process, so it's quite difficult for little British kids to get. But we learned the word prophylactic from Leisure Suit Larry. We learned the word falafel from Conquest of Camelot. But long before I'd ever seen a falafel, I learned, that falafel was something round and brown, and so don't let anyone tell you that games can't teach you anything. And that was a lot of fun again, very sort of sociable. And then I would kind of exchange games with friends at school. Like the Game All Night games, I think were a particular fan of, I think, growing up. And then I went to university, studied journalism because I didn't know what to do with my life, and journalism is really good if you don't know what to do with your life because it sort of covers everything. And at the end of my degree I started getting a little bit of freelance work for a women's magazine in the UK called Minx, and it was sort of a little bit edgy mainstream women's magazine. It did cover things off the beaten track. And I think one of my first pieces for Minx was actually a tiny little piece about Neil Gaiman's graphic novels, the death graphic novels that had just come out at the time, which I think was death, the high cost of living and death, the time of your life. So that's kind of a weird subject anyway for a women's magazine to cover. And then they started doing game stuff. And they wanted me to do it. And they only did it for about 3 or 4 issues. Maybe doing about 3 little reviews every issue. And then they sort of redesigned them, and it became all about lipstick and boys like every other magazine, and it sort of fell away. But it was enough time to get me on the press lists of games companies, so I started getting code and things like that. And you know, it was a kind of a fun time. I remember being on a really ancient coach with a lot of British games journalists dressed head to toe in flame retardant suits, looking a lot like the sperm scene from Woody Allen's All You Ever Wanted to Know About Sex But Were Afraid to Ask. So a whole coach for games journalists in white flame retardant suits. This was for a Shadow Man press launch, and the anticipation of what we were going to get at the other end because of these flame retardant suits was immense, and all we got was something happening with fire about 25 metres away from where we were. But that's one of my most earliest memories of being a games journalist. And then I started working for PC Zone, which was quite a hardcore games magazine in the UK. It was the longest running games magazine in the UK. And I was there for a couple of years, and I also wrote for Guardian as well. And then I think about 2002 I moved into freelance, and I coincidentally got contacted by a company called Lamian Studios in the UK, and in Belgium, and they'd done a game called Divine Divinity, which I was very fond of. I think I'm one of the few UK journalists that really loved the game, and they remembered me, and they were looking for a native English speaker to help them with the localization of the story and to do a bit of original content, and they thought of me, and I just got freelance, and it was really fortuitous. So I sort of thought, okay, well, this sounds interesting, I'll give that a go. I didn't really know much about games writing, no one was talking about it. There weren't people out there being games writers and talking about what they did. And so I did it, I came out, it put me off working on role-playing games for quite a long time until I worked on Risen. Because they're just so intensive, and there's just so much to keep hold of in your head. And I kind of thought, this seems to be some kind of career here. I wonder if I can get a bit more work in this area. And so I went back to some of the contacts I'd made as a game journalist. I just wrote them emails and said, hey, you know, I'm doing this now, and do you have any work for me by any chance? And actually some of that actually worked. I started getting bits and pieces of work through those contacts. I worked on a SpongeBob game, and I worked on a Pac-Man game, and I did mission dialogue on Stronghold Legends. I'm a big fan of Firefly's Stronghold series. And I think my interest in kind of eclectic, slightly off the beaten tracks games helped a lot. Because I remember going to see the first Stronghold game, and again it's one of my first games industry memories because they decided to demo the game in the deep end of a disused swimming pool in Munich, and it was freezing. And I remember seeing Stronghold, if anyone knows it, it's a castle building sim. It's very, very detailed. It's done by some of the guys that did the Caesar games from Sierra. And you know, I had little hunters hunting deer and bringing it back, and guys growing corn and making bread. I was just fascinated. I completely ignored the, you know, which I think I wrote off in my head as the bang shooty car game over there, which actually happened to be GTA 3, which I kind of, I thought, oh, everyone's looking now. I'm going to look at the game with a lot of little deer and hunters, but that was the one that got me work actually, and so that kind of worked out nicely for me. And you know, the Pac-Man and the SpongeBob game came from my love of a very underrated game called Ghostmaster, which was a bit like the anti-Sims. It was all about kind of controlling a team of ghosts and trying to haunt the humans and trying to rescue ghosts from the humans and things like that. And it was really good. And I kind of ended up being a contact of one of the guys that helped design and write the script. And he needed kind of extra people writing for some of the projects he was working on, and so I got some work there. And then my big game was obviously heavily sword, and that was kind of when my career sort of kicked up a few notches, and I actually stopped doing games journalism and just moved into full-time games writing. So that's a very long answer.
It was a good answer. So normally when we hear the word scripts, we might think of, let's say, film scripts or TV scripts. So what does script writing for video games technically entail? How does it differ from writing for, let's say, a TV show?
There are some similarities, there are crossovers. Again, it always will depend on the kind of game you're working for. So, for example, something like, let's take Overlord, for example. So that will have cutscenes in traditional cutscenes. So they're kind of written as you would write a scene in a movie or a scene in a TV series. There are sort of considerations that are quite unique to the medium in them. So you have to consider where they fall within the level design, the gameplay, what's going on either side of the cutscene, how the player is entering the scene and exiting the scene. Again, if it's an interactive cutscene, something like that you might get in Batman Arkham Asylum, for example, where you're held by some conceit, like Batman being on the gurney, being pushed through an area, and there's a cutscene sort of happening around them. Your Half-Life 2 has a good example of that in the Citadel as well, when you're in the kind of coffin-y porch type things that are sort of going through the Citadel. So if it's an interactive cutscene, you've got to look at the space it takes up, the time you're going to be allowed, how you're moving through the level. And we've had a few of those. I tend to work on a lot of things that have cutscenes on them, but with Overlord you've also got level dialogue, so you've also got that's basically what happens during a game, and the narrative involved with that. So in the case of Overlord, it might be what Noel says to you during the game. It could be, for example, if you've got a party-based game, it could be comments your characters make, it could be comments your actual avatar makes. With something like Tomb Raider, we had Lara talks to herself a lot. That's all part of the level design. Then you've got what we call, actually another example in Tomb Raider would be the enemy AI dialogue. So Lara could kind of creep up on enemies and listen to them talking about her and about the situation on the island and bits of gossip and things like that. And then you also have what are called barks in the industry, and these are just short lines communicating in a really, really gamey way stuff the enemy is doing. So it's kind of all the ways that enemies telegraph their actions in games. So they're defining 20 ways of saying he's over there or shoot him, and they can be actually one of the most challenging bits of games writing to do, because it can be very repetitive, and it's trying to find original ways of saying things. But it involves a lot of dialogue writing, and so I've sometimes been involved in games where I've actually come on to do that specific style of writing. For example, BioShock Infinite, that's what I was working on, that side of things on that game. So I was working on the enemy AI dialogue for Vox Pop and the founders, and on a BioShock game, the barks are still quite fun in the BioShock game. So it's all kind of, there is a core that's quite similar, but there's also these kind of things that are very, very unique to games, and are often revolved around how the game is played, and the mechanics, and the level design as well. So if you only knew about normal script writing, you would probably do a certain part of the game, but then you'd have to really kind of understand what was happening outside the cutscenes as well. Because if you look at a cutscene script, you get an idea of a story, but you would be missing large chunks that happen during the game. They're interactive, they're communicated by level dialogue and that kind of thing. So understanding games from a player perspective, I think, sort of really helps as well. I don't have any design experience, but I do have a lot of player experience as well, and I do have experience with journalists of being able to sort of cut down games into each sort of facet of things, and that's really helped as well, I think.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because video games are by default, they are interactive, which makes them different from, let's say, films or TV shows, which you just passively watch. So, how would you describe the relationship between the script and the actual technical elements of the game? Does one pay way for the other or the other way around?
Again, it kind of depends on the game you're working for. So it actually depends on a few factors. It depends on when, as a writer, you're brought into a game. So I work as a contract writer, so that means that I am a hired gun, basically. I am drafted in, parachuted in, if you like, to help out a game's narrative. And usually when I'm brought on board, the game will be in development for at least a year before I'm brought in. Exceptions to that tend to be if I've worked on a previous game. For example, like I worked a little bit earlier on Overlord 2 because I worked on the first game, so I had a good relationship with developers and I knew what they were going to do next, so I came in a little bit earlier on that one. But usually a writer, if they're going to employ a contract writer, which means they don't have a writer in-house, or they need more writers, or they've got someone like a narrative designer that they want someone to do the majority of the writing. And it's not like, for example, BioWare or Ubisoft, who tend to work with a team of writers that are there all the time. So I come in and I look at kind of what they have for their story, and you never know what it's going to be. Sometimes it can just be 5 pages of backstory, and there's no real indication of what's happening in the actual game. It could be that they have a fair idea of the loose structure they want, but they're not really sure of the kind of the core motivation of what's carrying the character through. They might have some visual ideas of what they want to do with their characters, but they might not actually have character to them. So often you will get, yeah, we think these visuals are cool, now come up with a character behind them. And that's kind of often the case. You often get a loose idea of what they want to do with the story, and then some character visuals, and then you sort of build it out from there. It is, I talk about being a bit like a Dr. Frankenstein type of exercise, like someone pushes a box of body parts towards you, and then you have to reassemble it, and you have to find the other bits and sew them together and things like that. And you never know. And usually how important narrative is to the game will have an impact on it. If it's a very narrative-heavy game, you're likely to be involved earlier. There's likely to be a lot of work involved, and again, if the team take it seriously, they'll get a writer in early. But often, writers are often drafted in very late in the process. I coined the term narrative paramedic for when writers are drafted in at the last minute and there's a script and it's not working and they're not sure why because they're not professional storytellers and they just know it's not working and they basically push it towards you going, save it, and it's bleeding and you have to kind of go in and all you can do is kind of fix the dialogue, and you can have crazy circumstances for doing that. Like they want you to fix the dialogue but it needs to be exactly the same length as the previous dialogue because they've recorded all the scenes, so all they're going to do is like dub your dialogue over the existing dialogue. But I mean, that kind of thing happens, or you're asked to write 100,000 words of dialogue in 2 weeks or something like that. And, there's often a lot of crazy deadlines and kind of objectives given to writers because people don't really understand how the writing process works. So they'll assume that writing is cheap and easy and it can just be sort of slotted in wherever and it doesn't really have an impact on things. And that kind of attitude is getting a little less in the industry, and we're getting professional writers in. They're talking about what they do. We're getting more people taking on roles as narrative designers. There's a lot more dialogue about games writing and how to do it well and what goes wrong and why than there used to be when I first started out, definitely.
So, apart from being a paramedic, in cases where you're not just drafted in to save someone who's bleeding and dying, do you feel like you have any influence as a writer on the general course of the game, or is it just, do you feel like you're one of the red shirts that can just be pushed aside, or do you influence like the whole thing? Can you contribute with something that will just like shift everything?
Again, it depends on your role. I think on smaller teams, you can have more of an influence because there are just actually less people to deal with. And for example, I mean, on something like Tomb Raider, I had a big influence over the character of Lara and how she was kind of realised and what her motivation was, and obviously that was very core to her journey. So on that side of things, I had a big influence there, as did John Stafford, who was our narrative designer, and Noah Hughes, who was our creative director. And the three of us were sort of responsible for Lara's journey. But I don't have an influence over things, or I didn't have influence over things in Tomb Raider to do with kind of gameplay or kill animations or the level of ambient noise Lara makes and that kind of thing. And that's a whole kind of different department, and I don't really have jurisdiction over them. But with smaller games, for example, something like Overlord 2, much smaller team, and so I actually worked quite closely with the level designers, certainly on, well, actually the first and second game, because it was a small team, I could do that. And it was done sort of electronically, it was all done through ICQ and file convergence systems, and I would, I'm stuffing in a special for my throat. I would work every day with each level designer, or every day we were kind of crunching, and they would tell me what they wanted for their level, and they'd kind of do me a rough brief of what their level was like, and I would create a script that worked for their level, and then sort of keep me abreast of things like whether some more space had opened up in their level. These were the essential things for them that they needed to get across in their level. And that meant that it was myself and the level designer working on, I was doing all the writing, but they were telling me what they needed. And that meant the script they got fitted their level well, because they'd had that influence in it, and that they were invested in it, they felt kind of consulted, and I felt that I'd supported their gameplay, they felt that they supported the story. And that sort of carried on over to Overlord 2 as well, and I worked a lot on the co-directing of the voice acting in Overlord, and I carried that over to 2, and I sort of put together the casting sheets, and I cast it, and I put together the scenes, and I directed the actors, and that was really satisfying actually, because it's sort of helping your script evolve from the page to voice and sort of seeing it put into the game. Whereas often writers, they write the script and they have no idea what happens to it until they actually see it in the game. And it could be very different. It could have gone through a lot of iterations. It could have been sort of pulled apart because of design decisions that happen. But usually it is much better if you can kind of hang on into the process and can see everything developing, because the thing about script and narrative feedback is there's a hugely long loop when compared to something like design. A designer can make something, see it working in the game really quickly. With a script, you write it, then you have to wait for it to be cast, then you have to wait for it to be recorded, and then put onto the animations, and then put onto the actual animations, and then the right sound work is put in. It takes a very long time before you're actually seeing the scene as you envisioned it. It's not like a movie camera where you could just shoot the scene, watch the scene. There's kind of a lot of faith involved. It's going to turn out right, and it can be like a year between actually writing the scene to actually seeing the scene finished. Longer than that almost. So that's one of the difficulties inherent in doing it, and it's just not quick to see results.
So it seems like you get more creative liberty with smaller companies, obviously. But what are the kind of most frustrating compromises that you have to make if you have this really sort of nice idea in your head and then someone comes and no, you're not doing that? Like, do you get those kind of situations where you have to compromise a lot on your creativity?
Definitely, and it usually is for gameplay reasons. I mean, the development is all about balancing the needs of gameplay and the needs of narrative. And the sort of the needs of the player to be having a fun experience, and certainly we went back and forth on that with Lara's ramp up from first kill to lots of kills, which was certainly people talked about a lot. And from a narrative perspective, I think the team would have liked a slower ramp up from her first kill to lots of kills, and originally how I wrote it was going to be a slower ramp up. But we've been quite slow, gentle pace in terms of giving the player access to weapons. So, we went the whole start of the game without having any weapons. And that actually, when you're a gamer, that always feels slightly unnerving. Like I play Bioshock, and I'm still nervous until I get the crowbar, even though I know nothing's going to attack me. There's that sort of feeling that it's not safe until you get a weapon, some kind of weapon in your hand. And we do go the first half an hour of the game or so where she's just puzzle solving and trying to get out of the cave. And then she's given the bow, and she had that for a while, obviously, and we've gone for quite a bit of time without actually not letting her have a gun. And this is predominantly, there's a lot of shooting in Tomb Raider. And that's one of the key combat elements of it. And so we kept a gun out of the player's hands for a while. We were getting the feedback that when they had the gun, they wanted to use the gun, and it felt a bit unfair to sort of not let them use it or take it away from them. And so that's one of the compromises where, for gameplay point of view, players wanted to start shooting things. From a narrative point of view, we kind of would have liked that to have been a bit slower. So that's probably a good example of where there has to be compromises, and it works for some people, it doesn't for others. But you do get those conflicts where, if you were doing it in film, you would do it differently. But it's the nature of games that you've got to try and find that sweet spot.
I remember we were talking earlier about at a different time about the idea of people who are really new to video game writing and how they have all these lofty ideas in their head that they're going to revolutionize the whole industry and write the best scripts ever, and how they are quite naive or overly optimistic about their prospects. So what would you say are the most challenging things that as a veteran writer now that you would like to tell those people what to look out for? I see it on the faces and in the comments of young games writers, where they have no idea why games writing is not better. It must be down to the writers, they're doing a shit job, let's get shit writers in, and we should be a lot better, and I'm going to revolutionise everything, I'm going to be a good writer. And that's clearly what we're missing. And I remember, because I kind of thought like that when I was starting out. It was kind of like I had no understanding of the process and no understanding of the challenges that went on. And I thought, I can do better than that. And I just feel that, and I see that in the comments where they just really have no idea what they're getting themselves into. And largely it's because you have to work in a team, probably. In some sense, more than any other entertainment medium. You've got novel writing down one end of the spectrum, where the author is the auteur, they're in charge of everything. They may have an editor further down the line, or an agent that gives them feedback, but they're in control of everything. And you've got things like film and screenplay writing, where if you're lucky, the writer will be in charge of the script for a while, and they may have a script editor, they may have an agent or a producer giving feedback, but largely they're in control for their portion of the development, and then it gets handed over to a director, and they may or may not use the writer. And then you've got something like TV writing, which can be a little bit like that, or it can be very writer-roomy, where you have a group of people and they're coming up with ideas for all the scripts, and then they're going off and writing their individual ones. That's more common in America, actually. In the UK, we tend to do one writer writing a lot of the scripts rather than a sort of writer-room sort of way of working. And then with games, it's a bit like writing a movie while the movie is being shot, the scenes are being built, the costumes are being made, and the actors are being cast at the same time. It's that level of craziness, because you've got gameplay for one thing, you've got level design for one another, you've got art that wants something else, and you've got design, you've got music and sound that wants something else, and so everyone is fighting for space and agency. And working in a narrative corner, and that's a corner that's been quite maligned in the past. It's not been one that traditionally has been occupied by professional writers. It's usually been done by designers or producers or whoever fancied the go. So having professional writers in the mix is still fairly new.
over the last 5 to 10 years, it's becoming a little bit more common, but still fairly new to have writers in the room actually doing the writing, which sounds kind of crazy that they would do it any other way, but that's just how the industry used to be run, and there is still a lot of kind of fallout from that writers are kind of considered some kind of mad luxury to do the actual writing on the game. The industry is kind of getting over that. And so working with that in that team, I'd say, is the most challenging. And knowing that, it's not a script or story-led process, in that story you may have moments where the story is going to be really important to the gameplay, and you might get some semblance of story beforehand, but usually story will get to a certain level, and then people will go off and do make their levels and design mechanics and things like that, and then story will get folded in more detail. You occasionally get more story-led games. Technically, Sword was actually quite story-led to start with, and then the story changed a little bit, and the level designs came in and levels came in and out. So working within that team structure and understanding the boundaries that you have to work within, you can't just do what you want, because there's lots of other people doing what they want as well, and they're usually higher up the food chain, narrative is. So you're kind of always, it is often a battle to get what you want, and it will depend on how receptive the team is to kind of narrative ideas, how important the story, the characters are to the game, and whether they're used to working with writers, I think. And that is a process in itself, I think. So, for example, with Tomb Raider, obviously Laura's characterization and her journey was very important. So that sort of meant that the narrative team had quite a strong role there. But you don't have control of everything that might feed into the story, for example, and that's the kind of thing that writers understand, but a lot of the other members of the team either don't understand so well, or don't get, or don't care, and that is, the narrative is in everything. It's in animation, it's in level design, it's in visuals, it's in mechanics, and so story sort of saturates everything, so it's sort of important to try and get it right at the start and build your story strong, so you don't have to bring in a narrative paramedic, and the industry is still getting used to that. So largely knowing that you're not in control, and you're going to have to, well, you're not ultimately in control, and you're going to have to learn how to be a cog in quite a large machine. That doesn't mean you can't be an interesting cog, you can't turn in exciting ways, but you are having to be part of a bigger machine and actually kind of learn how to support other departments, and be able to communicate how the story is going to help their level design or their animation. Getting used to that process, I think, is humbling, actually, and I think I can see a lot of games writers going out that think they're going to be in charge, and thinking, nah, you're going to have a rude awakening. I used to, as I said, I used to think, how is it going wrong, and how are we doing it better? Now I'm just impressed that anyone gets a story in a game at all. There's a vaguely coherent. It doesn't have to be good. You got one in there. I can't imagine what you went through to try and get a good story in the game. And if they can get a good story in the game, you have no idea how hard that is, and how many kind of battles and fights you have to be able to do that.
Have you ever had to fight your own battles with producers? Any instances where you were like, no, I want to do this, and they're like, no, you can't do this, and no, I'm going to fight my right to include this bit in the game? If you're working with reasonable people, then you can usually kind of go into bat for certain things to be there or not be there. I'm trying to remember instances that would actually be appropriate to talk about where there's certain things that kind of got in. If I can. There are kind of, it's sort of small battles. Sometimes it's as much, a line, it could even go to bat over a line, because, you believe in, the character would say that line, and maybe they think that,
the players wouldn't respond well to it or whatever, and it's about kind of fighting your writer corner, I think, and understanding your characters better than anyone else, and understanding the story better than anyone else, and that involves a lot of work. It involves I talk about sort of building the iceberg as a writer. So what you should do on a game narrative project is actually build everything out before you write the script. So the tip of the iceberg is the script, and it's what the players see, but you have to build out the whole world the kind of the players only see bits of. So you have to do all the character bios, the relationship words, and I kind of know random shit about your characters. Like I know the names of Grimm's cats in Tomb Raider. It doesn't, it doesn't ever actually come into play in the game, but I went so far into his character, I knew where he grew up, I knew what his childhood was like, I knew his pets, I knew his boat's name, and things like that, and I knew his history with the other characters, and that only, I could explore that a lot more in the comics, I think, than I could in the game, but actually it helped me get to know that character. And the same with the others, that it helps kind of bring a truth to those characters. And so a lot of what you're doing is world building, is character building, and then sort of only when you've done loads of that should you really go onto the script. But often you can be done with it, you've just got to do the script, and you don't have time to do all this. Sometimes it's seen as inconsequential, all this kind of work before you do the script, and sometimes developers don't always understand why, there's actually a lot of preparation work before you go write a script, and then there's lots of iteration, and again, development cycles don't always leave time for rewriting, and writing is rewriting. Nowhere should that be more the case than in games, because games development and games design changes so much, and you never know when you're going to lose a character, or lose a level, or merge characters, and it is that level of craziness that you'll have to adapt your story to. So, for example, with Mirror's Edge, that I've talked about in interviews, sort of at the 11th hour, all the level dialogue was cut out, because they decided that they didn't want Faith speaking during levels. It was a first-person game, they felt it was too distracting for players to have a sort of disembodied voice. But the whole script had been written and recorded for that to be part of the overall narrative. So that had the level dialogue had a lot of sort of plot and world and character deepening, and so just sort of taking that out, you're losing a lot from the story, and again, that was a sort of design decision that had happened, and had that happened early on, I would have written the script differently, and I would have weighted things differently. But that shows you actually how brutal development can be to the creative process, and you sometimes have no idea whether that's going to happen. And so as a games writer, you live in a state of perpetual fear that someone's going to cut a hugely important level to the story, or a character, or not let you do something, and just all you can do is try and get on with the people you work with, and fight your corner, and build your character strongly, and understand them better than anyone else, I think.
So since there's been talk of a lot of restrictions, a lot of frustration, a lot of fear, of things not going quite how you planned them to be. So as a contrast to that, what have been some of your favorite experiences in writing for video games? Like, what are the good things? What are the things that make you feel accomplished?
I really enjoyed the experience of working alone. I liked working with a smaller team. I liked getting that one-to-one with the level designers. I liked being able to create something that worked for them immediately. And I knew that when I took it to the creative director, it had been okayed by the level designer, and he knew that. And that was the point. I liked it when you can work with the voice actors. It was really fun directing as well, when you get a chance as a writer to even be in the recording studio and talk to the actors about their characters, and not just give them an Excel sheet of lines, which is what always happens in games recording studios, and I think it pisses off actors no end, because it's such a kind of impersonal way of presenting script. It happens all the time, and often they won't have someone in the recording studio that really understands the characters and what's happening and what their motivations are and what their emotions are and that's it. And the writer's a really good person to communicate that. So any time where you can kind of have as close as you can get to the end product, really, and sort of steering it through the choppy waters of development. So it was good with Overlord because I was there, creating a script and working with the designers and then working with the actors, and so that meant I could sort of see it through more closely than sometimes you get the opportunity to. So that's good fun. It's fun in the early stages, I think, when you've got not necessarily have any boundaries and stuff, and you can just come up with stuff and brainstorm and have ideas, and like no one's really standing in your way yet because there might not be that many levels. So that's really good fun at the start. It can often be quite the actual writing can be quite challenging depending on the schedule you're working to, because things might be changing whilst you're writing. Again, it's as soon as the game goes into production, it is like the film starting or trying to write it and catch up with everything else, and they're constantly changing on you. And so that can be very, very demanding and very intensive. When it starts coming together in the cutscenes is always great, when it actually starts living and there's been sort of definitely opportunities or definitely situations where John Stafford, the narrative designer, was saying with Tomb Raider, like there'd be a scene and suddenly like people wouldn't necessarily get it on the page, and then they'd see the scene realising like, oh yeah, it really works, and going, yeah, no, that's why we wrote it like that. But it takes that feedback a little bit so long that it often takes a long time before you see the scene fully together. And then there can kind of be bugs and terrible animation, and you have to watch the characters kind of going around like this all the time, and you get some terrifically scary bugs as well. And there's nothing like a good bug to ruin a scene. Like there's a bug in Tomb Raider, I think in radio it occasionally snuck through. I think I've seen it spoken about. I think it might have been to do with a particular graphics card. It was supposed to be when Lara went back to the Endurance. She'd been through a lot, and she was supposed to go back to her old cabin and look into the mirror and sort of have a thoughtful few seconds about what she'd become. And she sort of swings round, and her whole face disappears, and she's just floating eyeballs in a wig, which does kind of detract from the emotion of the scene. And that was by far the scariest thing I ever saw in Tomb Raider.
Okay, so are there any particular themes that you've given a chance you'd like to explore in writing for video games? I like certainly there are characters I'd like to explore. I'd like to see more. I'd like to see a military game with a female lead, for example. We are putting females on the front line now. They've always arguably supported the front lines. They've always played important roles in conflicts through the ages, and now we're kind of getting women on the front lines. And reality is overtaking video games now, and video games are still kind of, they'll maybe introduce the female character into the online, or female marine, female kind of soldiers, but only after dogs. Dogs get first billing, and then ladies afterward. And that's kind of frustrating. I'd like to do something, Vasquez video game kind of an exploit a female soldier, and there's great real world stories for that. I've often talked a lot about Twitter and how I would like to see a female character in the GTA 5 world, because that world is all about switching perspectives, and there's some great female criminals represented on TV, and they're not nice. They're despicable, monstrous people sometimes, but they're really well textured and interesting. And I'd love to explore that kind of thing. How we represent our characters, male and female, is still really, really narrow. I'd like to do a grandmother character or a mother character. You get father,
figures and you get kind of that parental angst, which usually from a father standpoint, apart from I'd say Bioshock 2 is one that does that kind of grapples with the idea of parents and motherhood and things like that. And there's so much I think we can explore with characters, with things like ethnicity and disability, and it's still really, really narrow in terms of what we do with our characters. People talk about how there are very many female characters in games. There aren't really many male characters in games either, in terms of it's usually the same male character, just kind of copied and pasted throughout the games. So I think there's a lot of love we can do with the characters, and I think we can come up with really interesting characters and then think what would be a great world to put them in, what would be great appropriate mechanics for their character. And so that's kind of where I'd like to see more games starting, is creating really interesting characters and then sort of creating a game from that.
So, nicely enough, you brought up the idea of, feminine presence in video games as characters, but let's talk a bit about women in the video game industry, because obviously you're a woman in the video game industry, so you have first-hand experience. How do you view your own role or presence in the industry? How do you view the presence of women in general? Is it something that there should be more women? Why not? What is your basic stance on that? Why yet?
It's changed over the years, I think. So when I first got into the industry, I just didn't want anything to do with women in games at all. I just wanted to do the work, and that was it, pretty much. And I didn't want to kind of get labelled any more than I thought was going to happen due to my parentage anyway, so I wasn't going to give anyone an opportunity to put even more labels on me. So I just did the work, and I didn't talk about being a female in the industry at all. And I think if you're a games journalist, if you're a female gamer, it's terrible that we have to use the term female gamer or female games developer. I hope there's a time when you'll just be a gamer or you'll just be a developer, but unfortunately we kind of have to go through this stage. So yeah, generally, if you've been a games journalist, if you've been a gamer that's been sort of fairly known, or a female game developer, you have been asked to contribute to that article about women in games, women in the industry. Everyone's been asked to do it. It's always the same story over and over again, and everyone's so surprised that women are playing games now. And we kind of roll our eyes and we get on with the actual making of the games or the playing of the games, and we know that the media is always at least 10 to 15 years behind what's actually going on. And then I think after Tomb Raider, I felt a little bit more secure about, my friends don't like coming out as a woman. I felt a lot more secure about talking about being a female in the industry, about female characters, because I had 3 of them. I had Noriko and Faith and Dara, and that's pretty unprecedented, really. I mean, there are so few female characters in the industry, let alone to have the same writer, let alone a female writer to be doing them. And it kind of struck me, I'm like, that's a thing, and that's kind of cool. And obviously with Lara, people were interested about the reboot, what we were doing with her, and suddenly I sort of felt that was the right time to start talking about these things. And I knew that I was getting loads and loads of emails from young women looking to get into the industry, and they'd read something I'd written, or they'd been to a talk, or they'd liked a game, and they just wanted a bit of advice about getting into the industry. And it was important to them that I was talking about what I did, and I was talking about who I was and how I got there, and being a woman was part of that, but it wasn't like the only thing, and it was about the work as well. And I knew that I kind of came to the realization it wasn't especially important for me being a woman in the industry, but it was important to other people, and therefore I kind of owed it to the next generation of developers to actually kind of stand up and be counted, because sometimes, as women we tend to be a little bit shyer about pushing ourselves out there and talking about what we're doing, and there's a lot of women out there that we don't see that are doing great, amazing stuff that aren't being sort of pushed into the spotlight and aren't taking the opportunity to go out there when it's offered. And also I think a lot of young girls don't really understand much about the games industry. They don't understand the opportunities that are out there. They think it's just hard maths and science, and you've got to be, very, very mathematical to be able to get into games, and they don't really know about design or art or music or writing and all the different facets of it. So I've been doing a bit more talking to young girls about the industry and how you can get into it and all the different roles, and they just don't know about it. And it's actually a similar problem that TV and film have, that young women aren't kind of aware of the opportunities out there. So I actually think programs like Little Miss Geek that are looking to educate young women about what's out there. Ultimately, you can't get people to do what they don't want to do, no matter how much you might want a nice gender balance. If women aren't interested in doing it, then you're not going to get women in there. And then, no one should be forced to do it just because of that. But getting people aware, I think, is very important. And as well as talking about what the bad side of the industry, talk about the good side of the industry as well, what's wonderful about it, what's creative about it, and what great experiences you can have, which is one of the reasons that I created the hashtag one reason to be, which was in response to the one reason why hashtag, which was about sexism in the industry, and I was kind of reading it, and I contributed a little bit to it, and I kind of thought, not sure this is helping. I think this is just compounding the problem, and I think it's really important to show that there's a battle happening, and that you're shining a light into the dark corners of the industry, and we're fighting here, but it's also important to understand what's the end of it, what's worth fighting for, and that's what I was trying to. It wasn't to counter one reason why, but it was just to balance. It was like, hey, this shit happens, but this good stuff happens as well, because I didn't want to scare young women off. And I do sometimes get emails from women going, I'd like to go into games, but I've had all this stuff, and is it really that bad? And you have to get women out there talking about the great stuff about the work, as well as being a woman. It has to be about the work, actually first and foremost, and talking about those opportunities that are out there.
So, do you ever feel, because you mentioned that even though you don't really consider yourself as a sort of front runner for everything female in game, but you do recognise your own position in it towards other people, do you ever feel pressure to include specific themes regarding female characters or presenting women in games in specific ways so that you are so that no one will show up and complain to you that you're a woman, you should be doing this instead of that because you should be aware of all the battle that's going on?
I think at the moment we're at the stage in the battle where having women in games is actually considered a good and fairly revolutionary thing. So our boundaries are probably, our barriers are a little low compared to perhaps where we should be. I've been very lucky the projects I've been on. I haven't gone out to work on games with female protagonists, and that wasn't my sort of, yes, I'm going to do that. I got Heavenly Sword because I knew the developers, and I met them a few times. I talked to them about what they were doing, and they kind of knew who I was, and I did a good test for them, and I had a lot of fun sort of working with what they had, and I did had about a 4-hour interview with them, and they actually shuffled out the room into the corridor and spoke in hushed tones for a few minutes, and then came back in and offered me the job. And it was kind of like I didn't think it actually ever happened like that. It's just how you get jobs in the movies. And then obviously my career sort of took off a little bit after that. And it was a great learning experience. It was a real trial by fire. Hybrid Rock, it was a very big game. The PS3 was only just come out. It just came out a little bit before that Heavenly Sword came out. And so there were a few, it became a perfect storm of being involved in the industry, kind of having met the developers, being interested in the IP, having the right kind of experience and background to it. And then Mirror's Edge, I was recommended by another designer that was working on a different franchise for DICE that had grown up in the same tiny village that I mentioned earlier with the 40 or 50 houses, and it just so happened this village just produced 2 people in the games industry, and we shared tortoises as well. Our family shared tortoises, so we had that kind of bond, and he recommended me for it. And then for Tomb Raider, I was already working with Square Enix on the title. and was recommended through the company. So they're all very kind of random individual ways of getting those titles, but neither one did I set out to kind of get, oh, there's a lady there, I'll go after that one. It was just fortuitous, really. But no, I've never really felt pressured. I think maybe people would expect, there's a level of expectation I feel I've got to do better with female characters than has gone before. But then I kind of feel that about all characters. I do like to give the amount of love, as much amount of love as I can give, and are allowed to give really hundreds of game development to all my characters, male or female. But I guess there is an expectation with female characters that they want them to be doing something different. They want to be seeing female characters portrayed in a different way than gone before. But usually I take on projects that are going to be doing that anyway, and that's a sort of requirement for me, I think.
We've been talking a lot about Tomb Raider, because considering that you have worked on the reboot, as you see out there, but how much of a challenge do you think the most recent Tomb Raider did pose, given that Lara Croft is an iconic character, and the end result of that game, the reboot, is a lot more realistic or grittier than what most gamers are used to? Did you feel like threatened at all tackling her character, because she is quite a cult-icon character?
No. In a word, really. I think if you're going to feel threatened by that sort of thing, you shouldn't be there. Because it should be about the challenge, and it should be about pushing yourself and pushing the industry. And yes, it hadn't been done in games that much, but it had been done elsewhere. I mean, if you look at the reboot of Batman, if you look at the reboot of James Bond, they've gone back to these sort of darker, more origin story kind of movies, and so Tomb Raider was doing a similar thing. And I was a bit concerned that I didn't have enough background knowledge of Tomb Raider because I'd only played a couple of games, but actually Crystal didn't mind that at all, because I needed someone that kind of had an idea of Lara and had some experience with the games, but they ultimately wanted to do something different and take what they particularly thought was strong about the character and her background and her abilities and strengths, and just sort of portray that in a different way and show the strengths and traits emerging. And I mean, some players think she's changed a lot, but I think that as we see this character evolve, that she will go on to be not exactly. She will never be exactly the Tomb she was before, and I think that's okay. But I mean, she is on a similar path, but we're trying to keep that humanity there. We're trying to. I don't want there to be a point where Lara is never touched by what's happening. And I think I want to create a character that if she finds that she's not being touched by what's happening, she's actually sort of assessing what's going on inside her. And that's something that was happening with this Lara in terms of journey. Crystal, we used to talk about old Lara as being Teflon Lara. Like nothing ever touched her. She was almost a little bit cold. And I say occasionally, I said the films kind of went that way as well. And we wanted to kind of bring back that warmth and that humanity. I mean, old Lara has some great, fantastic things about her, and I think we've kept them there. We just wanted to kind of do something different and refresh her, and I think we've been largely successful, but you can't please everyone.
So on that front, considering that you mentioned that you've played games since your childhood, what are your all-time favourite games, and what are the ones that strike you at this point in time as something that you either respect and admire from a professional standpoint or as a gamer? I think not in any particular order, but I love Psychonauts. That's usually one of my top games that I always flag up. I love the charm of the game in that it's touching and funny at the same time, and that's really difficult to pull off outside of games, let alone in games. And I thought it used level design and storytelling in a really unique, powerful way. I loved Vampire
about the Masquerade Bloodlines. I thought that was superbly written, and it was a shame that sort of Troika didn't get to sort of finish it properly, and it's a testament to how great the game is that the fan community has kind of rallied together and just mended it. And there's about 7 to 9 fan patches to kind of get the game running and on its feet properly. I mean, it's a great game, it's got great characters in it, and I really enjoyed that one. I loved Half-Life 2, and particularly the episodes. I think that the episodes were really, really strong, and particularly how they developed the character of Alex as well. I love the Bioshock games as well. I'll often play the Bioshocks, I'll play 1 and 2 and then I still haven't played all of 3 yet because I've worked on it a bit, and so it's all a little bit weird going back and playing it. Find that I love the environmental storytelling, I love the feel of the world of the Bioshock games. Really enjoyed Deus Ex Human Revolution, I thought that was a great one. And I guess I'm sort of dabbling in casual games a lot at the moment because I think the iPad's been great for kind of casual games, and also some hardcore games that have been ported. Like I played Baldur's Gate on the iPad, and I've explored so much more of the game than I actually did on PC because it's so portable. Because it's so easy to go in and out that I'll decide, I'm going to go to every corner of every map, and so that's been a lot of fun. But I think the core component of the games I like is the way the world's making me feel, and it's that kind of world building. And often characters do have a lot to do with that. And sometimes it can be just really good kind of animation and some fun lines. Like I love the Dungeon Keeper games, and I'll go back and play them. They can actually quite difficult to get working on modern operating systems. I'm really grateful for things like blog games that will kind of get it running for you. And I'll play the Dungeon Keeper games once a year, and every now and then I'll start getting that itch of I need to play Dungeon Keeper 2 again. And that's I call that a cozy blanket game. That and Bioshock are my cozy blanket games. So I'll go back and replay them because I know how they're going to make me feel, and it's a good feeling. And sometimes I prefer to go back to old games than try new ones where I'm a bit unsure whether I'm going to get that feeling again. So it's kind of I'm at a stage where I've got so many writing deadlines that I'm sort of just going in and out of games. But it's actually the indie games I'm most interested in at the moment. So when I have more time, it'll be things like Gone Home and The Swapper and The Unfinished Swan and things like that I'll be playing because I think there's some really, really interesting things going on there.
You mentioned that world building is really, really important to you in gaming. So, do you think that ties into the narrative prospects that games can provide, as opposed to mediums like film or TV? As in, do you think that games provide a different kind of narrative means compared to movies or other media?
I think world building is a core component of that, and certainly you probably build the world much bigger than you kind of would for a TV series or a film. And the real estate for narrative storytelling in a world is so huge. You mentioned environmental storytelling, and Bioshocks are really good for that. And you have such a lot of real estate in the game to use environmental storytelling. And the difference between environmental storytelling in a game is to a film or TV, which does use it, but the audience may see that environment for a few seconds and then it's gone and they might not remember it. But again, they're poking around in every corner of the world, they're looking at everything, they're reading everything, they're sort of studying placement of the bodies, and everything is folding into the story. So that's why I always say that Bioshock is a great example of that, because it uses every corner of the world to tell a little bit of story without sort of doing it verbally. It allows you to look at something and interpret what's happened there, and I think that's very powerful, and it gives you a very a sense of being part of the world and something interesting and important that's happened. I think world building storytelling is key to environmental storytelling is key to what games do very, very powerfully.
So, are you happy working with video games, or do you have any other aspirations or pursuits as a writer? Would you like to expand towards film and TV even more? I mean, you're doing The Watch now, or is that something that you'd like to do more in the future?
Definitely. I mean, I've been very lucky to have other projects come my way, so I've done a few short stories. I've done a bit of comics work now. I did the Mirror's Edge comics with DC. I've done the Tomb Raider comics with Dark Horse. I'm doing a very small part of the comic for Dynamite, the Red Sonja Legends anthology. Gail Simone is putting together, and I've done a very small 6-page story for one of the comics. So I really enjoy doing that, and I've started to do a lot of screenplay writing. I've just finished my second screenplay, which is called Warrior Daughter, which is an adaptation of a book of the same name. And that's been done with script development funding from the BFI and Creative Scotland. So that was a really great opportunity. I quite like adaptation, and what I do in games is kind of like adaptation. You're sort of taking ideas that exist and trying to make them work narratively, and kind of using the mechanics of a game to do that. And so that was a lot of fun. It was great having a long form script to work with rather than kind of, it can be a bit bitty in games. You're doing a bit of story and then there'll be something else that happens and then you get a bit of story, and you may come back and you may do the core story first and then come back and fill in the other bits. And so it seems linear, but it's often not a linear way of working, because you might be writing things out of order depending on what the schedule for game design is, for example. And I think it actually just makes me stronger as a writer. I mean, I'm not doing any writing, for example, on The Watch yet, but I am creating a lot of ideas. I did work on the pitch docs for the characters and world and things like that. And I will do, hopefully, some writing further down the line. But I've just really enjoyed expanding to other mediums, because it strengthens me as a writer, and you can never stop learning and practicing and getting better. And that's one of the great things about being freelance. The bad side is you're not there on the floor trying to keep your story intact, and you're a little bit more removed, and so you have to rely on other people to do that. But you do get that opportunity to work on other things, work on other games, work on other projects, and it strengthens you as a writer. Whereas I think if I was just writing in games, that probably wouldn't feel challenging enough for me. I'm always looking for the challenge. If that's in games, great. If it's somewhere else, awesome. And it's just that's the most important thing for me. I mean, I love to work on a challenging indie game where I can kind of do some really interesting stuff there, but I don't get asked to work on indie games. Actually, the only one I have so far is which was quite a small project with me. It was kind of a script publishing project. It was a sort of narrative paramedic project where I just came in and helped them with their script. But like I said, there's some really, really interesting stuff going on in that field. So I hope one day, maybe.
So what are the things that inspire you as a writer when you get a project and you're called in to either be a paramedic or you get more free rein on the project? What do you turn to in order to become inspired?
Originality, I think. That sort of, oh yeah, I haven't seen this before, or I think that's a really interesting way of looking at things, or a world I've not seen depicted. Heavenly Sword, is very character driven, and that definitely interested me. And having two female protagonists really in a sort of a sisterly kind of relationship, I was really drawn to an artwork, because the artwork was fantastic for it. With kind of Mirror's Edge, it was a really interesting world. The sort of the dystopian future we're used to seeing is kind of more like Blade Runner. It isn't this kind of shiny, sort of almost too perfect world. And I was kind of really intrigued by the idea of creating a kind of movement that existed in this world that seemed wonderful, that kind of exploited some facet of it. And so that definitely attracted me, and again, the art for Faith was great. I got hating, and they've got some really great ideas here. And Tomb Raider as well, actually, art has a lot to do with looking into it, and the art for Tomb Raider is so strong and so powerful without being sexualized. And I think that this is something I do kind of mention because I don't think it gets the props that it deserves. You know, with the old Tomb Raider like covers, you used to see Lara kind of out with her guns or doing that special comic book move where you try and show your tits and your ass at the same time and sort of bend your spine into horrible contorted positions. And we're kind of used to seeing that kind of image of Lara, and we had the concept art in the box art for Tomb Raider, which was sort of standing in a cave with the bow on her back and the pickaxe, and she's kind of holding her arm and she's looking down. I mean, it's characterful, and it's kind of like, there's a character with something going on. And I love the kind of one where she's talking her arm as well, and they're not sexualized at all, and they're powerful and they're beautiful and they're strong. That really attracted me to it as well, and I think that's, you know, I've always been really, really impressed with the art that's come out of Tomb Raider.
Okay, since we're at Fanfest, which is an event for fans, also by fans, and also for professionals, I'm going to quickly ask you a question about your favourite types of popular media, both when growing up, when you were like a teenager, and at the moment. Like, what were your favourite comics, TV, film, books, all that kind of Spanish stuff? What did you grow up on, and what are your favourites right now?
Okay. I grew up in the 80s, which was really good for a couple of things: fantasy films and strong action heroines. So it was a heyday of fantasy films like Legend and Labyrinth, Dark Crystal, Time Bandits. It's also great for, as I said, strong action heroines like Ellen Ripley, like Sarah Connor. And my parents were actually fine to allow me to watch things like Conan or The Terminator or Aliens because they wouldn't make me cry. Whereas children's films with, like Watership Down, which I maintain is a terrifying film for children and adults alike. If there was a bunny with a scratch on it, I would just be floods of tears. Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim, or it might be called The Secret of Nim, but that might be a second movie. If there was a small mouse in danger, that would terrify me. But for some reason, Arnold Schwarzenegger hacking people's heads off, I was absolutely fine with this kid. So my parents made sure that I had a steady diet and that kind of thing. And I think that had a lot. A big impact on me, and only as an adult looking back to it do I actually see it. In that, you know, when it comes to, I thought that fighting aliens in the future or killer robots, I thought that was just something women did. That's what movies told me, that this is what women did. And so I kind of found a way of making that true in some ways. I said during the 80s, fantasy movies and strong action heroines had a big impact on me. I read a lot as a kid, and I started reading from an early age. And I don't read as much. I don't read nearly as much as I should now. And that's always something I'm trying to remedy. And now I do watch a lot of, not terrestrial TV, but I watch a lot of kind of box sets and Netflix on that, and I think there's some really wonderful character work happening in TV, and I think that tends to be the most progressive medium. And I've always been a big film watcher as well, so I actually wanted to do a film review before I was a games review, and I tried out for various film magazines and didn't really get anywhere, so I went into the games, got somewhere, and then actually ended up working for film magazines as well, a film magazine called Hot Dog in the UK. And so I've always been a big film watcher. Really like my horror films. Some example for one example, I really like horror films, but I can't play horror games. Like I have to get someone else to play them, and I'll like sort of sit behind them with a cushion. But I like horror films for some reason. And now it tends to be actually about a lot of TV, consume a lot of TV, and I'm always watching things in the background. Huge Joss Whedon fan. Buffy, Firefly, Angel, and Buffy is kind of like a cozy blanket TV series. I will put it on in the background, and God, there's something reassuring and comforting about the Buffy music, and like I genuinely feel a sense of comfort when it comes around to that time of year and on goes Buffy season 1, and I know I've got like entertainment for quite a while ahead of me, and then I can go on to Angel or Firefly or whatever, and I think that has been a big, I think that's been a big influence for me, and I think Joss Whedon does wonderful characters, and some of those, I think the actor thing has been great on that as well. I don't think he can write a weak female character. He's always his female characters, some of his male characters are great as well, but his female characters, there's something especially great about them. And I think that owes a lot to Granny's. Like, he was very close to his Granny's, and I think they influenced him a lot, and I've been close to my grandmothers, and they influenced them a lot. So yeah, basically, 80s fantasy movies, action heroes and grannies, they're my biggest influence.
So, if you were 15 years old today, as in 2013, what do you think you'd be a fan of? Would you be watching like Sherlock or Supernatural or something like that? Would you be gushing about on Tumblr? What would you be doing?
God, I just had the realisation I probably loved exactly the same things I like now, which suggests that I haven't changed at all since I was about 12. I do actually, I haven't fully caught up on Supernatural, but I did like Supernatural because for a while there was that Buffy void, wasn't there? That sort of Buffy Angel void where there wasn't anything that was quite hitting that spot, and Supernatural for me came closest. I think it started off very kind of Monster of the Week, and once they got into their own narrative, it was, it was much better, and it got really fun, and that was, I enjoyed that a lot, but I'm also enjoying the sort of, the worlds that we kind of don't see, like Orange is the New Black. Was a new one that I really enjoyed because it was, just a fun, textured, adventurous series, and it's got such really kind of wonderful, twisted female characters in it that you don't really see that much, and it's kind of genuinely funny enough the way you stop thinking, I'm watching lots of female characters here, isn't that unusual? They're just like, here are really interesting characters and interesting circumstances. So that has been a favourite. I guess I'd be a bit young to watch Orange is the New Black. But I probably like the same things. I don't know if I've ever gone through a profound shift. I think what I watched during the 80s pretty much kind of dictated my likes and dislikes. I still kind of like the same stuff.
Do you think you'd be following actors on Twitter or being a Spanish girl? Do you think you'd be like more secluded in your way of living? Because obviously along with the internet, the way that we approach media and our fandoms, it has changed a lot. So do you think, what kind of person would you be now?
God, I don't know, I'm actually constantly glad I didn't have Twitter and Facebook when I was a kid, because I was teased and bullied, not some amount. Like there were kids that got it worse than I did, but I was on the bullying, teasing spectrum. I grew up with bottle bottom NHS glasses and teeth that were not only gapped but malformed as well, and sort of straggly brown hair. So nature didn't deal me a particularly pleasant hand as a kid, and so bullying, teasing, etc. And I also went to English public school as well, which is especially good for that kind of thing. And so I think I just wouldn't have survived with Facebook and Twitter and all those, imaginative and accessible ways of teasing and bullying someone. So I'm kind of glad that didn't exist then. And I'm very glad about the time I grew up in. I think it was. The 80s were a great time for film and music, and that has really shaped me. I don't know if I would be following people on Twitter. I hope that my parents would have banned me from using Twitter and Facebook if they had any sense, and I'd hopefully still be reading books.
There's actually one more question about your, not parentage as such, but considering that you mentioned a lot how your parents have been pushing you towards different sorts of media and sort of making sure that you get a cultural education. Do you feel that you were more encouraged to be creative when growing up, and has that affected your career choices?
I think my parents were very hands-off parents. I think maybe that's something to do with being an only child. Like, you become very, very independent, I think, and very self-assured. I was a very self-assured child, and I grew up in the English countryside, and my parents were old folkies, they called themselves, and they were sort of semi-self-sufficient. We had goats in the front garden, chickens and ducks in the back, and it was a little pink cottage on the edge of a valley, and they used to go horse riding and things like that, and we kind of just run around and be free in nature and walk the goats. And I grew up, and then we had to do things like milk goats and spin wool, and it's like, I think that's kind of rare nowadays. I don't think kids learn how to do that sort of thing. But I'm really blessed to have had that kind of childhood. And my parents weren't rich, my dad wasn't famous then, but I had nature and animals, and I never kind of wanted for anything, because I kind of understood that the environment and countryside was kind of wonderful, and I really enjoyed that. And I think my father, and to a certain extent my mother, definitely encouraged me to have an understanding and a respect and a wonder of nature. Your dad if there was something interesting happening and I was asleep, he would just wake me up and take me out to see the interesting thing, be that Halley's Comet or glowworms or something like that. He thought it was more important that I had the interesting experience than I had to sleep. And I think that's I quite like that attitude towards parenting. And so I kind of grew up with that sort of respect and joy in nature, I think. And actually it was my mother who used to tell me stories. Everyone assumes that my father must have been telling me stories. My father was writing down the stories in books. My mother was telling me the stories to stop me crying when I had my hair washed in the bath. And they were usually about being miniaturized. My mother was obsessed with me being miniaturized and going to visit the starlings that lived in the roof, or going to visit Keith Floyd, who was a British TV chef who drank a lot on TV, and I'd turn up and get materialised onto his cooking show and tell him off for drinking too much wine. So she was very creative in that aspect as well. She was also trained as an artist, and my father's also very artistic as well. So I think they kind of didn't encourage me to go into, certainly, art, and they didn't want me to do art A-level. I remember wanting to do art A-level, and I'd done a lot of art bits and pieces off my own back, but I think they whilst being kind of polite and diplomatic British parents, didn't actually say don't do art, but they didn't encourage me towards art, because I think my mother got pushed into art very early, and she sort of regretted it a bit, and so I think they wanted something a bit more stable for me. So I did a bit of art stuff, and I enjoyed that as a kid. But I think they were very keen that I take English at A-level, so that's the only thing I've ever remember my parents insisting on, was I take English at A-level. So yeah, they were they very much let me kind of make my own meandering path through the world, and they seemed very the belief in me that I would eventually find something that I could do and suited me. So they never kind of pushed me that hard. And I kind of wrote a little bit when I was a kid, and I did a few short stories, and I never really showed them to my father because I was a bit worried he'd start doing things to them, and so I never kind of showed him stuff like that. Art, I would show Mark kind of stuff I was doing, but I would never show him writing.
So now that we know a lot about your background, because a lot of us obviously are more familiar with the Twitter kind of way rather than the 80s way, because many of our visitors are either born in the 80s or the 90s. So if there's someone here who would sort of be interested in a profession like yours, what would you recommend for them at the moment, how they should pursue that dream? Because you started out in journalism, and obviously the people here being from Finland are sort of world market in Finland, for example, is quite different. So they were interested in not just doing gaming work in Finland, but wanting to actually be international. Or do you think they should still follow that kind of similar path, or not being born in the 80s?
Well, there's still a lot of good 80s stuff around there. There's a lot more information about games writing now. Like, I haven't asked so much about it that I have an FAQ. That if you email me via my website and you want to know more about games writing, then I will send you a very handy FAQ I put together about what I get asked about games writing. Because if I address every email, I will never have any time to do any work. So I put something together that I can just say, hey, I haven't got time at the moment, but here's something really useful. Then that sort of talks about good books to read and places to go. It's still a relatively small industry, and all the jobs that I have got are through recommendations, more or less, from developers I've worked with, people who've known me as friends, or any permutation of that really. And you never know. When a kind of contact or a friend is going to produce work. Like, I got work on Bioshock Infinite from someone I met 10 years ago. And so it's getting out there in the industry and meeting people and talking to people has been really important. Like, I got my first bits of work because I've met the developers face to face, and that can actually make a world of difference. So going to things like Develop or GDC or Game Horizon or any of the great, GDC Europe as well is really good, any of the great kind of game conferences and meeting developers and looking at the games that are being created now. And I think if I was starting again, I would probably look at the indie development scene. I think there's some really, really interesting stuff happening there, and I think it's becoming easier to create games than it was before. So that's probably where I'd start. I think the fan modding scene has always been a really great way of getting experience of working in teams as well. There's some really good books about games writing now. The IGDA, the International Game Developers Association, has a writers special interest group, which is just www.igda.org/writing. If you just look up IGDA writing, it will come up with that. And that is a group that you can join, and it's full of writers like myself that I've been doing it every day. It's sort of students or just other developers that are interested in narrative, maybe they're narrative designers or they work in audio. And it's a really great place to get advice, to just talk about issues that are happening. And that the SIG itself has produced, I think, 3 books now on games writing. It's all written by kind of from the trenches people that are kind of working on games every day, and it covers things like working with voice actors or working on new IPs, working on licensed properties, and it is a really great resource. And then, you get lots of articles from writers talking about working in games, but also you have to improve yourself as a writer as well. Never forget that it's not right, it's writing in games, and so strengthening yourself as a writer and practicing, and if it helps you going to workshops and things like that. I've been to McKee's story workshop, I've been to Sid Fields' screenplay workshop, and they've been kind of useful. And reading things like story and screenplay and Save the Cat and things like that, and the writer's journey. The writer's journey is a great one. Or go further back than that to the Hero with 1,000 Faces. And kind of understanding the craft, and that's something you never should forget. And there's some really great blogs out there with writing advice as well. So it's sort of it's threefold really. Kind of keep up the writing and keep getting better. And it's sometimes difficult to kind of grasp getting better. All you know is when you got there, and it's a really kind of weird, nebulous process you kind of go to. You don't exactly know how you get better or how it happens. You just do it by practicing a lot, and you start to understand the shape of stories and the shape of characters, and then before you know it, you can just do things better. And so practice and shape yourself as a writer. Play lots of games, understand games, look at what's happening with narrative in games, how it's being shaped, and different things that are happening. If you want to create samples, and you haven't done any games work before, I always recommend looking at a game you like and then maybe creating a cutscene that could have happened in that game but didn't, or some level dialogue that could have happened but didn't. And that way, that it's just something you really like that you feel passionate about. And then for the network, so we improve the writing, we get to know what's happening in games, and then network, just get out and meet people. It makes a world of difference.
Okay, I think now it's time to take questions if the audience has any. You can basically ask about anything or any specific things that you want to know about the titles, and I can just come over and hand you the microphone if anyone wants to ask anything. If there are no questions, we'll just keep chattering about something, but hopefully someone will have something to ask.
Hey, you talked about being a writer and working with the developers of the game, but how it differs from when you're working with a professional writer, like with Bioshock Infinite, with Ken Levine, my personal idol. How is the process with that when you are not the main writer, but you have to follow the rules that another professional writer has created for you?
I mean, that can actually be a lot of fun. I mean, it was great getting the opportunity to work with Ken. Obviously, I was quite down the food chain in terms of I was just kind of working on the AI stuff, so that was my kind of area I was working in for a while. And then so they had people like Drew Holmes, who was kind of like a lead writer role with various other writers. I'd always wanted to work on a Bioshock game, so that was a really great experience for that reason. And it's wonderful working with other writers with it because there's so few of us in the games industry, and there's so few people that understand story in the games industry. Many people think they understand story because they've watched films, or they've watched TV, or they've read some books, and think that watching stories means understanding them, but actually it's very, very different, and understanding structure is something that you it's a process that you by watching and reading and practicing and getting it wrong, and then getting it wrong but in a different way, and then kind of getting it a bit right, and it's a process you go through and you learn, and see the shape of the story, how a story is put together. And you can only do that by I think a lot of writers have an innate understanding of the story, and then that's kind of, sometimes I would get a point where I know something works or it doesn't, and I can't really break it down to explain why it does, because it's sort of a magical thing that happens. There's something about writing that is inherently magical as well, and so it's a bit difficult. I always find it very difficult to teach because I find it very difficult to break it down, how it happens and what the spell is to make good writing happen. You just kind of know when you're doing it. And so having anyone on a project that understands story really gets it is marvellous. And it becomes more common to go into a project and have maybe one, maybe two people that really understand the story, and you kind of want to mentally hug them every day you work with them because they understand the story and they get it and they care about characters, and that's amazing. And so you're kind of grateful for doing that. And it's certainly with Prince and Courage, I worked with another writer on that. So the main story was done by Andy Walsh, who's another UK games writer and a good friend of mine. When I came in, I worked on what's called the on-demand dialogue system. So the dialogue between the prince and Electra as they go through the game, we did a bit of work on that. And Andy came in to help me with Heaven and Sword, so he worked on the dialogue, the soldier dialogue on that, and sort of ambient bark dialogue for the soldiers. And we kind of both came together with another UK writer called James Leach, who's done a lot of black and white stuff. He's now doing Goddess for 22 Cans for Blizzard. So the three of us working on that. And so it's not unfamiliar to me to work with other writers. So yes, it's really good when you get to work with other writers and they really get it and you get on with them. And it doesn't matter to me if I'm happy to go into a project to help support another writer, because I know I might be needing the support of another writer. You don't get that many solo writing teams these days, so it's quite often that you're going to help out another writer. So again, a good reason to network and get to know other writers, and just try and be a good person. Don't annoy too many people. Has certainly helped me out.
Okay, anyone else? Quickly here first, and I'll come over to that side. Hi, I just wanted to ask about narratives. Could you tell a little bit about how you got involved in the project and how the main character came to be?
So with Mirror's Edge, I think they'd had trouble finding a writer, I think, so they were quite late in the design process when they managed to find me, so all the game had pretty much been designed when I came on board, but it had no narrative thread to it. So they had the levels that they wanted to do. There was no real narrative thread of why those levels existed and what the character was going to be doing in those levels from the story. So it was a really backwards way of working, which isn't unfamiliar with the games, but this is probably, Mirror's Edge was the game that's probably the furthest advanced when I came on board. So with that, I had to work backwards. It was like, here is a set of, sets really, and stages, and now kind of work backwards and create a story that will pull them all together. And it's not the most ideal way of working. But it is something that happened. So they had a visual at Faith when I came on board, and they had but they didn't have a character for her. So it was sort of, this is a cool visual that we have created and we like, but we don't know the person inside it. And that was kind of true. They had other visuals that they liked. I think they'd gone through various concepting for the gameplay, so they had various things that they were thinking about doing with characters, and they created various characters. And Faith was one that they really particularly liked, so they pulled her out of it, and they decided to make her the protagonist character. And so a lot of my role was working out who Faith was, and why this world existed, and how the runners existed in this world. And keep coming up with the idea of runners. Like, they had no game. Well, they had a game, but they had no sort of they didn't even have a title when I took it on board. And I remember that coming up with the title was such a long, laborious process, because anything to do with speed or kind of movement has been taken by racing games. So that was quite a long process, and I think Mirror's Edge was one of the many hundreds of titles I came up with, and we just kind of liked it. And I remember everyone thought it was weird when it came out, and then like no one thinks about it now, but it kind of makes more sense in the game. And so it's really about creating why this world existed. It was the whys, and sort of breathing life into it. It's the same with Lara. There was a visual. It's kind of like, now put the person into the visual, and that's a lot of what you end up doing in games writing. You'll get some visuals, and they won't necessarily understand that character as a character. To be fair, Lara they knew some of the things they wanted to do with her, and then I came in and sort of birthed her into a character. But with Faith, there wasn't really a character there. There wasn't really kind of any relationships and things like that, and so that was the whole thing. It was kind of built retroactively around the game and around the assets that existed.
Okay, so there's someone here. Hello, my question was about Discworld and Discworld games. What's your opinion of the Discworld video games, specifically Discworld 1, 2, and Discworld North? And do you know if there's going to be any more? And is there some particular type of Discworld game you'd like to see done?
I don't think I've played much of them while. I played 1 and 2, and I really enjoyed them. They were back in the, I did the last. Like, I managed to get a bit, they've been in a resurgence recently, but like, they were kind of at the end of the last kind of big bloom of adventure games, and I think they were very, very well done and bizarrely difficult. And every time you give a solution, like if someone asks you about a puzzle solution, it always sounds like you've got mad. Like you give the love custard to the sheep, so that then there's like you had to pin the rosette on the sheep after it's had the love custard, and I didn't remember much about it, but for some reason love custard has a phrase that stuck with me. And I would like to see a this one game. There's nothing in the at the moment, and occasionally Dan has had pitches for games. But that is from his elders was a big gamer and savvy one as well. And I think we would get pitches in and he'd say, okay, show me what you can do. And they would kind of, people would shuffle off and never bring them back. But Dan wanted to see what they were going to be doing with the mechanics of the game. And not just approaching and go, hey, let's make a Discworld game. And you say, okay, well, what kind of game then? And I go, oh, okay. I thought we could just get away with just saying we wanted to do it and let us shuffle off and do the rest. So we never had a really good pitch. And it would, we'd need one now. And I'd certainly be interested in trying to get long games on something like an iPad. Because I think particularly 1 and 2 would be great touchscreen games. But it's such a weird, working out who owns the rights to them it becomes really difficult because Psygnosis went down and it was bought by Sony and then kind of were closed and it's like no one's quite sure who owns what. So that's something that's currently being investigated. So I am, through kind of trivia, quietly trying to find out if those games can be brought back in some way. I still don't know the answer to that, but it is something that I'm personally interested in doing. And and certainly no one is averse to again, but we'd have to have a really good pitch and way for that. Thank you.
Hi, have you ever thought about going sort of the indie way, coming up with a whole new idea yourself and then assembling the team around yourself? And do you think that would be too big a process for you?
It is a bit scary, which probably suggests that I shouldn't do it. I kind of quite like the niche I've carved out for myself. I like going in and helping other people with their ideas and kind of finding my creativity within there and breathing. I like the breathing life into things. And so I am slowly kind of doing more of my own stuff, but it is things like adaptations that are really much harder to do. I'm taking more and more projects. I really enjoyed the comic stuff, and that has been a lot of original stuff for me. I don't know if I would. I think I'd have to have more design experience to really do that. I think for me, I'd have to have that. So I think you have to have that understanding of game mechanics. What makes a good game. And so if I was sort of found a really good designer and they had the same sort of narrative abilities I thought I could work really well with, I think that would be good. But I don't think I have all the required skill sets to do that. And I am interested in India. I think a lot of interesting things are going on there. Pick up my strap, I'm definitely interested in this. I don't often get asked to do stuff. And I'm kind of somewhat envious of people like Tom Schubert who do get to do indie stuff. But then he said, well, I never get to do AAA stuff. So mainly, at some point, was wrong and arguing with my AAA, so I'm still bigger than these. But it's all about the challenge. That's what I look for with every title, whether it's an indie title or a AAA title. It's about imagination, it's about challenge, it's about doing something different. But when I say challenge, it's not about writing 100,000 words in 2 weeks. It is about that imagination, that something different, that spark. And that's exactly what I look for in games, in screenplays, in novels, in anything. It's that kind of graphic originality.
Okay, can you try twisting the microphone a bit, like, make the range of it? It's like a bit weird. Okay, let's hope that works.
At the E3, the EA announced that there's going to be Mirror's Edge 2. Do you do any work on it, or do you have any influence over the story of the Mirror's Edge 2?
No, it's probably the shortest answer to that. I don't even know anyone at DICE anymore, so I have no idea what's going on there. They own the IP. I have nothing to do with it. That's kind of one is slightly heartbreaking, I guess, thing about games. You sort of help create this baby, and then you sort of send it off into the world, and it kind of doesn't even write back and send a postcard or anything like that. And it's sort of a little bit sad, but I just don't know anyone. I don't know anyone else now. I have no idea how it is in production. I doubt they're going to talk to me, to be honest. You know, the first game was difficult. There was some good stuff in there, but obviously I wasn't happy about so much of the script being cut out. And you know, I spoke about why that happened, and what I felt that impact that had on the story, and whether it hadn't happened, but I kind of understood why it did. It is kind of important to talk about what happens during development and what can happen to the story, and how we can help remedy that, and how it's really good to get the writer in before you design the whole game, because it's really difficult to fold a story around a whole game that's been designed with no story in mind. I don't really know how I feel about it. I can't write more games, and so it's a great, it's a great world, a great character, and I think they've got some really interesting stuff. They've got very talented people. If they wanted to talk to me, I'd be happy to chat to them. But it'd have to. I think the project would have to work in a different way to the first one, and I'd have to know that it wasn't a case of retroactively fitting the story around levels, that the designer didn't have to work differently. I'd have to be more involved earlier on, and I guess that's what the ship is saying. And it's a little bit sad, but on the other hand, that's the way the industry works.
Okay. Okay, that way. This one first, and then move on.
Okay, so how do you feel about Hideo Kojima and the Metal Gear Solid series? Like one person being responsible for pretty much everything, the story and the directing. And also, what's your preferred way of telling the story in a game? They use cutscenes, but they're movies, things, How would you like to drive the plot?
I see nothing wrong with having auteurs, like Kojima or like Ken Levine. Personally, for a game I prefer stuff that Ken Levine does. I have played some Metal Gear Solid games in the past, and I find it cool, and I like the fact that there are people, coming together with a vision and delivering on that. The cutscenes, I think when people think about cutscenes, they can often think that they're all going to be like Metal Gear Solid and they're all going to be about 5 minutes long, and it's all going to be part of the movie. But I think there's a lot, and I've never been fond of the really, really long cutscenes, to be honest. But I did grow up playing things like Diablo 2, which was like great cutscenes. So I think well done cutscenes that aren't intrusive on gameplay, and kind of almost use as a reward mechanic. It can work really, really well. And obviously I've done a lot of games that have had cutscenes in them, and that's not necessarily because they say, oh, should we tell the story in one cutscene, and then that's how it's been done. It's usually because they wanted to tell the story that way, but then we've also told the story through, ambient dialogue, or level design, or environmental storytelling, and everything else. So I have no preferred way. And it's usually down to the design mechanics that will dictate how they want to tell the story. And usually that's when a narrative designer will get on board. So the narrative design is all about the mechanics by which the story is told. So narrative designers may be writers, or they may be just responsible for those kind of mechanics, getting it working again. And I think more narrative designers get into the industry, the more we'll see different ways of telling cutscenes, because it's not the original way of telling narrative. I don't like a good cutscene. and I have no problem with them. But they are a tool. They are a tool in the toolbox, and they shouldn't be overused, and we should use all tools available. To be honest. So yeah, I have a great respect for devs like Kojima, like Levine, like Tim Schafer, and I'm really glad that such people exist. It's really difficult to do that, but on the other hand, when you're at the top of the food chain, it is a little bit easier to be able to say, I want it this way, and for it to happen when you work narrative and you're looking further down, you don't get that chance to say, it will be that way and that will happen, all you can do is sort of, you have what's called soft power. You can kind of nudge and suggest and kind of worm and tongue through things and just try and get things to happen. You don't have the hard power of instantly going to say, it's going to happen this way because I want it and I pay your salary. And I kind of get ideas of that power now and again. Does that answer your question? So yeah, I like cutscenes, but I don't like them overused. I like to see more exploration into how you tell narrative. And I think the game scene is doing some really interesting stuff there. And I think Bioshock have been great with narrative storytelling, and I think that's definitely something that's taken off since the first Bioshock. People have actually started looking at that a lot more because of that game. And to a certain extent, Portal, but used it, although in a slightly different way. So that's something as a writer I would always be thinking about if I was storytelling and talking to artists and level designers about how to make the most of that during their levels. Was there one at the front? Okay.
Earlier this year, in the Tomb Raider, there was a scene after Lara was captured by the enemies, and it caused a massive controversy in the media. What's your take on it, and how do you approach like the controversial subjects when you write games or stories?
I don't think anyone expected it to be controversial. It's completely a controversial scene in every other media. So it wasn't expected. It was never intended to, I think some people thought that it deliberately put in or spoken about the way it was to light up some kind of controversy. It absolutely wasn't. So yeah, it's a surprise because that particular trailer had been out for a while and there'd been no controversy, or something there was controversy. And the problem was that no one was seeing it in context. They were seeing bits in the trailer, they were hearing bits of an interview, and they hadn't played the scene in context. And so many people had, and the ones that had couldn't speak about it. So it became an echo chamber of assumptions on assumptions. And some people were talking about why we done it, who we were, and what our agenda was. And I hadn't been enough writer, so I couldn't talk about it. And so it was a shame that it came out the way it did. And I was, being a former journalist, I was a bit irritated with certain sections of the media that seemed to be literally finger pointing and clickbaiting about it. Because that's what we hate the wider media doing to us. The wider media judges us out of context and finger points and says, I'm the video games industry, look what you've been doing. And they don't understand the context of it, and they don't look at the bigger picture. And I thought, if we can't stop ourselves doing the same thing to us, then we cannot expect the wider media to stop finger pointing us. I think it actually caused an interesting thing. So I think there was a real value in it for me. I think it brought interesting debate about the way we talk about our characters, the way we talk about the relationship between the player and the player character. So I think it was ultimately valuable. It's a shame that controversy happened because some people will always believe the first thing they hear, and it doesn't matter how many people say, it's not really like that when you play it totally makes sense. When people played it, they were like, okay, well, no, it totally makes sense in context, and it's not this huge thing that it was made out to be, and it's part of a journey. It's not the one thing that defines her, or the one thing that shapes her. which is what it was kind of, the way the media made it out to be. And there wasn't, some people didn't even realise that that was the scene because they were expecting something else and therefore thoughtfully dropped it because of that. But it didn't change at all. It was exactly as we had intended it. It was done, we thought a lot about it. It was an honest scene for those characters in that moment. It wasn't prolonged, it wasn't done for titillation. It's uncomfortable because it should be uncomfortable. We wanted it to be uncomfortable. But it was, you kind of need to play in context to kind of truly get it. But we put a lot more into that scene, and it's a shame that it kind of got misjudged, and some people maybe have been put off by that. And I hope we managed to kind of get a few people back. There were some gamers were initially a bit sceptical about that scene, and felt a lot better when they played it. So yeah, it had value. You have to look at some writing and everything.
Okay, I think.
That's a wrap, ladies and gentlemen.